Good Sunday morning. This is Charlottesville This Week, and I'm your host, Marcelo Rollando. My guest today is Guy McPherson, Ph.D. He has been on the show, but I think maybe 2 years ago now. Good morning, Dr. McPherson. How are you?
Good morning. Thank you. I'm doing quite well.
Good. It's good to hear your voice again. I remember we had quite a conversation the last time. I'm sure we will this time, too. Dr. McPherson has a regular column for the Weekly Hubris in Greece. So he travels about the world, and he is, how shall I put it, without being tarnished by financial compensation, he collects and compiles and presents evidence of abrupt climate change. Now, of course, the operative word there, I hope everyone heard, get your cup of coffee, is abrupt climate change. So let's start right with that then, Guy, if you don't mind.
Sure.
What's so abrupt about climate change all of a sudden?
Well, this is something completely different from the inconvenient truths, Al Gore perspective, and also from the perspective we've heard about, most of us, probably since the 1970s or 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
James Hansen testified before Congress in 1988. So we've had plenty of warnings that climate change would result from human activity, and it has, and it goes on because of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that industrial civilization is putting up into the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've known about this for a while. But then, as it turns out, there's this phenomenon that is completely different from that linear, relatively gradual climate change, and that's called abrupt climate change. There is precedent in planetary history for this happening, albeit not with humans on the planet. But before humans showed up, there were these events during which the planet heated up very rapidly in a short period of time, or cooled down rapidly in a short period of time. And so we appear to be in the midst of abrupt climate change right now, consistent with events that have occurred in planetary history, based on evidence from things like sediment records and ice cores and so on. And so it looks like this particular event is almost certainly going to remove habitat for many, many species on the planet, almost certainly including our own species. And we tend to think of ourselves as not requiring a habitat, because after all, we live in homes and in cities, and the water is delivered through the tap, and the food comes at the grocery store, and so on. But, in fact, like other animals, we depend upon a stable habitat as well. And so it seems to me that we're in for a really, really rough ride in the not-too-distant future.
So when you say abrupt climate change, and I gather that you think it's manifesting in various ways, can you give us a little more specifics about how many different ways, examples of this manifesting so quickly? That a sensible question?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. There's an analysis put together by somebody who online is called Sam Carana. And this analysis was put together in July of 2016, so just over a year ago, on his blog, which is called the Arctic News blog. He indicated that just adding up all of the contributors to climate change in the near future, things like the loss of ice in the Arctic leading to absorption of more energy rather than reflective, increased methane in the atmosphere, things like the 10-year lag between when we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and when we experience a maximum heating associated with that carbon dioxide, and so on. So you had all these things together, and he came up with a 10 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline temperature by mid-2026. And for relevance, for context, that would be a higher temperature than that experienced by this planet in the last 2 billion years, by quite a bit. So the highest temperature experienced by this planet is about 23.5 degrees Celsius. That would take us up over 24 degrees Celsius. So that's a huge number. And it's
yes.
difficult for me to imagine humans surviving. And so I did my own analysis of that. It appeared on my blog, guymcpherson.com. And I came up, taking a very, very conservative approach, I came up with 8.7 degree global average temperature rise between then, July 2016, and 10 years out. And so that goes right between the temperature, the highest temperature ever experienced by the planet in the last 2 billion years, a little bit lower than that, and a little bit higher than the temperature that the planet has found itself at for most of the last 2 billion years, which is 23 degrees Celsius. So somewhere in between there almost certainly leads to lost habitat for our favorite species, Homo sapiens. And for that to occur in only a decade is truly unprecedented, and yet is not particularly surprising given the self-reinforcing feedback loops we have triggered.
We're going to have to take a break, but before we do, you mentioned, I think you said that you put information on your blog site, but I kind of lost you when you gave the site. Could you do that for me again?
Yes, it's called Nature Bats Last, and it's found at the URL, guymcpherson.com. And if you go to August 1st of last year, of 2016, there's a post there, an essay called The Politics and Science of Our Demise. So that's where I connect the dots on that.
Okay. We're going to take a break. We're talking to Guy McPherson, Ph.D., who is an expert, an author of at least 9 books, I know, numerous articles, has a regular column for the weekly Hubris in Greece. And he's talking to us about not just climate change, but abrupt climate change. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to Charlottesville This Week. I'm your host, Marcelo Rollando, talking about abrupt climate change with Dr. Guy McPherson. And there is an article that you wrote in May of this year, 2017, that sort of extends and supports what you are saying. You have further data?
Yes. Yeah. You know, the post from August 1st of last year had, of course, been eclipsed by subsequent data, by subsequent information. So on May 30th, 2017, I delivered a short presentation to a group of international environmental law students in Brisbane, Australia. I did that via Skype from where I live. And so there's a video version and a text version of that 20-minute presentation. It's called A Brief Overview of My Message, and I delivered it, I think, 2 days before that, May 28th. And so I posted it on my blog, guymcpherson.com, on May 30th. So a brief history of my message. Sort of ask the questions, what would you do if you, this is how it starts. What would you do if you had 10 years to live? How would you ask? How would you live? What if it was 4 years? What if it was 14 months? What if it was 4 months? So I'm asking the questions, would you live more fully every day? Would you live more fully every moment? Would you prioritize your work differently? Would you prioritize your relationships differently? You know, these are the kinds of things that we don't really think about in this culture because we're so entranced by the infinite growth paradigm. We think this whole thing is going to go on forever and the future will always be better than the past and blah, blah, blah. And we balance that with Homer's message from, 2,600 years ago in the Iliad, that every moment may be our last. And we don't think about that part very much, but it's there for those who are willing to accept that death is always over your left shoulder. Right? It's always there. Every moment could be our last. We all know that, but we act very differently. We don't live with much urgency. And the data on abrupt climate change indicates that we should be living with urgency if we are to capture the most out of this short time we have on the planet.
That's so biblical, too. I mean, you know, there's scripture that says the next moment is not guaranteed to you. And yet you're right. Who wants to think about that? But I guess if life is important to you, if people, relationships, family are important to you, then you should think about it, not as a negative, but hey, how am I going to, as you say, how do I prioritize? How do I use it? What's important to me? Anyway, a slight shift,
right.
if I may. Go ahead.
I would say, in fact, that it's beyond a biblical message. It's a spiritual message that applies to any way that we live, whether it's one of the Abrahamic religions, including Christianity, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's some Eastern religion, whether it's Hinduism, whether we're an atheist or agnostic. The notion of living fully in light of our lives being pretty short, and even if you live to be 100, I promise it will seem rather short when you get to your final days. You know, that message is often interpreted as a spiritual one, even though I don't think of myself as a spiritual person. And I have no problem with that. You know, so if you interpret my message as being a spiritual message, as long as it encourages you to live with urgency and to complete relationships at every turn, so that when you say goodbye to somebody, you know that it might be the last time. You know, then that's fine. If you interpret that as a spiritual message, good for you. And especially if you think that spiritual message is a good one.
Well, again, everyone can choose their glass. It's either half full or it's half empty. I choose to make it a wake-up call, to make me aware, you know, to rethink my day, my time in moments, in relationships, and just to do the most with every moment. I mean, everyone says that when they have a near-death experience. I realize the value of my life and I'm going to change. Well, we're all sort of walking around with a near-death experience. Is that being too dramatic? No,
I don't think it's too dramatic at all. We are all walking around in the midst of a near-death experience. Habitat for Homo sapiens has already gone away in many places around the globe. People are fleeing the Middle East and Northern Africa, not because they don't want to live there anymore. They've lived there their families have been there for generations. They're leaving because they are no longer able to live there, because it's impossible to live there, because there's no habitat for human beings. And the same is going on many islands in the South Pacific. The very small sea level rise to date has destroyed habitat for human beings on these islands. You see the same thing in Miami, for that matter, where the intrusion of salt water into the freshwater system that serves as the water coming through the taps has made it far more expensive and in some cases essentially impossible to provide clean water. And that's right here in the United States. So that's stunning that we're losing habitat very quickly.
And not seeming to notice it.
And we're just at the early stages of abrupt climate change.
And we want to make a distinction. I know you did in the beginning of the first segment, but in case people are just joining us, you are saying abrupt climate change is something separate and in of itself from what former Vice President Al Gore has been telling us. Not that he's wrong or right. That's not what we're saying. We're just saying it's different.
That's right. It is different. And he was largely right at the time. You know, that was more than 10 years ago that the film came out, and then he was talking about anthropogenic or human-caused climate change. It's just that now we know a lot more, and we're beyond the point of gradual change, the likes of which we could make changes that would make a tremendous difference in how this turns out. Now we have entered the arena of abrupt, irreversible climate change, and that's really important. It seems that there's nothing I know about beyond technology that doesn't even exist yet that could turn this thing around.
All right, I'm going to have to stop on that note. We have to take another break. We're talking to Guy McPherson, Ph.D., and we're talking about abrupt climate change. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Charlottesville this week. My guest, Dr. Guy McPherson. I have a question I've been wanting to ask you specifically. What's the evidence that the wheat crop has failed? If it's failed, what do you think caused that failure?
Well, it seems that the United States wheat crop has suffered up to about a 50% loss because we had a mild winter in the interior of the northern hemisphere, and so the wheat grew quickly through the winter. And then there was a late winter, early spring freeze event accompanied by hail and snow that destroyed up to 50% of the wheat crop in the United States. That's a huge blow. as with any civilization, this one depends upon the ability to produce, store, and distribute grains at large scale. Wheat is a major player there.
Oh, okay. And why aren't we hearing about this? Am I the only one surprised by this?
That's a very good question. Why aren't the mainstream media picking up on this and promulgating it everywhere? I've seen it in a couple of sources, but then it disappears in the 2-second news cycle that we've become accustomed to. It pops up. You aren't really paying attention and saving those links and revisiting them. It all goes away so quickly, and now we're on to the next celebrity scandal.
Exactly. All right. Speaking of things going away quickly, how should we live our lives if we cannot reverse abrupt climate change? I guess this is a question for everyone, so I'm asking your opinion, but it's something everyone needs to think about and answer for themselves. How then do we live the next 10 years? Right.
And maybe, any moment might be your last. Maybe you have 5 minutes. Maybe you have 3 minutes. We don't know. And that's the problem. That's the ambiguity of this whole thing. If we only have 10 years, if we only have 4 years, if we only have 4 months, do you even want to know? Some people don't even want to know. And so it doesn't affect how they will live. For me, this has this notion of abrupt climate change and loss of habitat for Homo sapiens in the very near future has brought urgency to my life and makes me want to complete relationships with the human beings in my life, so that when I say goodbye, it might be the last goodbye. And I want to tell these people the feelings I have for them. On the other hand, I also want to acknowledge and recognize that nothing of any significance is really under my control. What's under my control is those relationships and how I treat people. What is not under my control is climate change, for example, that has been ratcheting up for the last 265 years since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That's not under my control or yours. We can change our light bulbs and drive a different kind of car, or drive less, or bicycle, and so on. But in the grand scheme of things, you and I, I'm afraid, no matter how we vote, no matter how we shop, we really don't have much impact over what the future is going to look like. The exception, and it is really an important exception, is how we live and how we treat those around us, and living the small world that E.F. Schumacher talked about so long ago in his writing. We have the ability to influence a few people around us. Let's do that. We have the ability to influence how we live as individuals. Let's do that. Let's take what Buddhists would call right action and not be terribly attached to the outcome, because even if we do everything right, the outcome, I promise, is going to be not what we want. So let's live with that. I don't have a problem with that at all.
Okay. But you're not talking about, I don't think, you're not talking about Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma, even though they came so close to one another and were ferocious and damaged. But we've had terrible hurricanes in the past. People forget. As a history buff, I remember Flagler's Follies and lived very in that area. Not back in 1935, but I lived in Florida. I lived in South Florida. I lost a home to Andrew. So that's not what we're talking about. Tell us in our last moments here, what are we talking about?
We just don't know. Louis C.K., the stand-up comic, the social critic, has this little bit where he says, you don't know when you're going to die. This is the best you can do is you can say, this is probably it. You never know that this is it. And I'm reminded of Edward Abbey in 1989. He had his friends take him out in a sleeping bag to his backyard in Tucson, Arizona, because he thought he was going to die then. And so he's laying out under the stars, and he's waiting for death to come, and it doesn't. And so after a while, he has to yell, hey, guys, I'm not going to die today. I thought this was it, but it was only probably it. It's not actually it. And he lived for a few weeks longer. Living with urgency is something we can do every day. Telling the people we love them that we actually love them is something we can do every day. Acting with compassion, acting with empathy for humans and other organisms, those are things we can do every day.
Yes.
Will it matter? Only to us and the people we influence. Does that matter? I would argue it does.
Yes, I agree. All right. We need to, as I mentioned, you've written a number of books and articles. Tell us again how we can learn more from you about abrupt climate change, whatever website or Facebook information you can give us.
Yeah, I've recently deactivated my Facebook account because I'm starting to live my message, finally, of living instead of living on Facebook, which are two completely different experiences.
Yes, I agree.
and so I still have my blog called Nature Bats Last. You can find it at guymcpherson.com. And I write there occasionally. I post video there occasionally. And this interview, for example, will be posted there in the not-too-distant future. So you can find me there. All my contact information is there. You can send me email messages. I'm easy to track down, and I'm very responsive to people's messages.
And Nature Bats Last. Yes?
Yes, that's correct. And it's recognizing that ultimately we are one among about 1 trillion species on this planet, and nature is in the driver's seat. Exactly. It ain't us.
All right, then. Thank you so much, Dr. Guy McPherson, for being on Charlottesville this week. I really appreciate talking to you, listening to you, and learning from you. And I wish us all the very best and to seize the day. How's that?
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This has been Charlottesville This Week. We hope you've enjoyed the show, and we'll come back next Sunday morning when I'll be chatting with Charlottesville This Week. Have a great week. Bye now.